Yeah, if anyone doesn't know, go check out Inferno. She'll be hopefully streaming on Wednesday. That'll be cool. Maybe we can raid her. So, yeah. Is that a bit? Thank you, Cinesemiax, for that bit. I appreciate it. Alright, so we've got self-knowledge and the limitations of narrative. Let's do this. There we go. By Jeanette Bicknell. And who's this in? This is in Philosophy and Literature. So, cool. In this passage from his Confessions, St. Augustine recounts some youthful shenanigans. Screw you, St. Augustine. Oh, jerk. In a garden nearby to our vineyard there was a pear tree. Late one night, to which hour, according to our pestilential custom, we had kept up our street games, a group of very bad youngsters set out to shake down and rob this tree. We took great loads of fruit from it, not for our own eating, but rather to throw it to the pigs. Foul was the evil, and I loved it. I loved my fault itself. Base in soul was I. See, young St. Augustine was cool. Old St. Augustine was like, get off my lawn. Here, a mature Augustine looks back on his boyhood self with recrimination and reproach. Stealing pears is not seen as an immature prank, but as evidence of a base soul. Yet, for all the force and gravity of his words, it is not difficult to imagine a younger Augustine, before his conversion to Christianity, light-hearted, reminiscing with friends about these very same incidents. Of these two stories, the one he tells in the Confessions and the one he might have told, which provides a more accurate portrayal of Augustine's boyhood soul, which is closer to the truth. Yeah, the pears are super early in the book. Yeah, this is like very famous story from St. Augustine where he's like, oh man, I was a jerk when I was younger, but then I found God and now I'm a good person. It's like, no, you're probably a jerk now. And young St. Augustine might have stolen some pears, but like that's not a big freaking deal. Like it was probably, yeah, someone would have been sad about their pears, but like still, it might have been cool. Narrative and personal identity would seem to be inextricably bound. Telling stories or imposing a narrative coherence on events is one of the main ways in which we make sense of our experience. We also get to know others by listening to their stories, thus learning the narrative coherence they have placed on events in their own lives. Over the course of a lifetime, stories may change. This is a good point. You change your own history. You think of things differently. Characters first dismissed as bit players may gain importance. Gestures or words earlier thought to be unimportant may, in retrospect, take on greater significance. With time and reflection, one's past may be reinterpreted as displaying error, alienation, or ignorance. A cataclysmic religious conversion is only one of the many factors which might prompt such reflection and reinterpretation. Illness, divorce, and the death of loved ones are other possible causes. Cinesemiotic says, I have to point out that literary significance of pears is one of the is of sexuality, similar to the apple but slightly different. You know, that's right. I had not thought of that. I am not good at this stuff either. This is one of my other weaknesses. Is I do not have enough of a literature imagination. But like I this is what I mean. Young Augustine sounds like he was fun. Old Augustine sounds like he's like get off my lawn jerk sort of person. Like, I don't want to be friends with old Augustine. I want to be friends with the young Augustine. So the author says, here is my worry. Presumably, we would like to believe that our new stories are improvements on the old and that they reflect greater self-knowledge, possibly even greater moral awareness. Yeah, I mean, I like to think that, but I can distinguish between my past self when I was being a moral jerk and having fun. So I'm not entirely sure. Yet, given that any number of possible narratives can make sense of a set of events, how can we determine that any one story or way of understanding the past is better than any other? How are we to distinguish those stories which reflect greater understanding from those which are simply redescriptions or reinterpretations without greater insight on the part of the individual? We may disagree about particular cases. Those with a religious worldview are likely to believe that, post-conversion, Augustine is telling the right story about the pear theft. However, most would concede that some ways of understanding the world are simply less adequate than others. Less adequate both in the sense of less reflective of the truth and less conducive to good relations with others. Cinesemiotic says, young Augustine had a lot of sex. Old Augie is grumpy because he's got blue balls. I think that's accurate. Few would defend the worldview of the inveterate racist, for example. The problem of determining whether a story reflects greater understanding and self-understanding is all the more challenging if we take seriously the view that narrative structure is the organizing principle not only of experiences and actions, but of the very self that experiences and acts. How radically must one's personal narratives change before her very identity has also changed? I mean, it's like an apple or the egg thing. You might change the stories and then realize some things in the stories and then later realize that you have changed, or you might change yourself and then reflect differently on the stories. It's like you could do one or the other. Maybe one's harder than the other, but like, if you change your stories for whatever reason, maybe it's not sort of like personal growth, but maybe you just learn more stuff like factually about what was going on at the time, then maybe you can get like some sort of external change that in your stories that actually does change your identity. But like, I mean, how much does it have to be? Who knows? Depends on yourself. Yeah, apple or the egg thing? Yeah. Yes, I'm losing it. I'm sorry. Chickens. Yes, chickens. Concerns about the epistemological status of personal narratives bring us up against the limitations of narrative as a tool for understanding persons. I knew I said something wrong at the time, semiotics, but like I didn't have enough like brain power to like think about what I was saying about in the past while I was thinking about the paper and what I was saying. I can't do 3, I can do 2 at once. So yeah. In this paper, I do 2 things. I illustrate some of my worries about the epistemological status of narratives through an examination of Tolstoy's short novel, The Kreutzer Sonata. I argue that, despite protestations to the contrary, the protagonist has not acquired greater self-knowledge. He has changed the stories he tells about himself without having understood his past or those around him any better. Yeah, you can just get older. That doesn't make you a survivor. It just makes you older. Like, that's all it is. It doesn't make you better just being older. It's like people think just because they're alive. Nah, you're alive maybe by the grace of like some other power, not because you're clever about things. Then I sketch what a genuine increase in self-knowledge and moral understanding might look like. For this, I will rely on the discussion in Spinoza's Ethics. Spinoza is particularly useful for my purposes here because the moral transformation he describes includes greater self-knowledge. I then briefly consider another short work by Tolstoy, his late story, After the Ball, for a concrete example of what genuine self-knowledge and moral enlightenment might look like. I mean, this is interesting. So there's a question. Can you actually read off a person's growth from the stories they tell? I don't know. Because some people are extremely clever. And so they may just be able to fake like being smart. Like they can make up for their failures morally by being clever in the stories. Like they may have, done something for the wrong, like you can maybe have more what looks like moral progress, but for a non-moral progress reason, because you thought it was like aesthetically a more interesting story that this person changed, but you may not actually understand that it was an ethical change. You may get it right, but for the wrong reasons. So that's the question is, like, could you actually read off the increase Odysseus does that. Interesting. Yeah, see, is what I mean. Like, I don't know my stories. I should know better. Literature is not one of my strongest suits. But like, can you actually read off like a change in a person? And I know I've got like some academics here, and I know I probably got some people in school at the moment. Like people on Twitch are, like college kids in like, 20s, 30s, and some of you guys are academics. You can see people's writing get better over the course of a year. You can see it. Like in academia, you can see, okay, at the beginning of a semester, your writing was like this. At the end of the semester, your writing is like this. Or like, you've got a grad student that starts off with crap writing, and then at the end of the, you get your PhD and it's not crap writing. And so it's like, something can definitely be seen, but like it's not going to be clear if that's like necessary that like you can always read it off. Sinesemiak says he was mostly giving a wink to say the most important part is to tell the story they want to hear, so I'll lie to them blatantly. Yeah, well, if you're a writer, you have to tell stories people want to hear, or else you're just talking to yourself. And that's always the thing. There's always an audience. That's Rhetoric 101. Yeah, Batman Dark Knight. Yep. It's always an audience. Yes. Okay. So we're going to be talking about some Tolstoy. Poznishev. I apologize for how I speak about Russian too. The protagonist in the Kreutzer Sonata relates the story of his marriage to a fellow passenger over the course of a train journey. The climax of the story is Poznichev's murder of his wife in a jealous rage after he has become convinced that she has been having an affair with Trutskachevsky, a violinist. We never learn whether or not his suspicions were justified. Interspersed with the narrative are Podnichev's reconsidered views on marriage and human sexuality. These are strikingly similar to Tolstoy's own, expounded to the best of my knowledge, and untranslated afterward to the novel. So interesting. So we think that this character is basically a stand-in for Tolstoy. Podnichev claims to have greater self-knowledge than he did before his crime. He says that while he was in jail for 11 months awaiting trial, I pondered over myself and my past and came to understand it. He presents two parallel causal histories of an emotional life dominated by anger, jealousy, and spite, recounting events both as he understood them at the time and as he has come to see them in his newly enlightened state. At the time of the events he recounts, Podnichev's at the time of the events he recounts, Podnichev attributed his negative emotions and the quarrels with his wife either to trivialities, problems with the children, the household, etc., or to his wife's difficult character. As he tells his fellow traveler these events, however, Podnichev is able to identify what he now sees as the true cause of his unhappy marriage, namely that both he and his wife were victims of the prevailing unhealthy and immoral attitude to sexuality common to their social class and contemporaries. Podnichev elaborates, the sex passion, in whatever form it is presented, is an evil, a dreadful evil, which is to be combated and not encouraged as it is with us. Yet there are good reasons to reject as spurious Podnichev's claims of greater understanding and to suspect that he has merely replaced one set of pretext with another. This is particularly apparent in his descriptions of his wife and attitudes towards her. Yeah, so this is fair. Have you just replaced one bad story with another and called that progress? I mean, this is the sort of thing that happens all the time. People do this. They come up with, they think, oh, I screwed this up, but now I'm better, and I'm better for these reasons. But you're not actually better. You just you've told yourself a new story, and you think because it's new, it's better. Well, no, you're just trying to separate yourself from the old one. And so this is a question. Again, it's fun. I can write something. I haven't written anything down yet today. I'm going to write that. How do we actually? What are we going to call this? Can I tell you a better lie now? And that's a question. Can I tell you a better lie now than before? Or am I actually getting to be more moral now than before? Or is it just a better lie? Here's one example of the dual history of emotions relayed in the Kreutzer Sonata. Podnichev tells his fellow passenger that vituperations were called forth by the coffee, the tablecloth, the carriage, a move in a card game, things that could not possibly have held the slightest importance either for her or for me. For myself, I may say that at times my hatred of her reached a fantastic pitch. At that time, I failed to notice that my feelings of hate regularly and inevitably followed the periods of what is called love. A period of love, a period of hate, a weak period of love, a brief period of hate, an intense period of love, a prolonged period of hate. We did not then realize that this love and hate were different aspects of one and the same animal feeling. And I just want you guys to notice, all you people out there, I can read good writing without stumbling over it. Philosophy is so hard to read. By animal feeling, Podnichev has in mind what he has come to regard as the unhealthy sensuality between him and his wife. The text of the Kreutzer Sonata allows at least one alternative set of reasons for Podnichev's inability to understand the cause of his emotions during his marriage. Rather than a mistaken conception of the nature of physical passion, Podnichev's ignorance of his own emotional states and unhappy marriage could stem from a lack of self-knowledge more generally. His answer could stem not from an unhealthy attitude toward sexuality, but from his frustration at his inability to control his own desire, at his inability, indeed the impossibility, of controlling his wife's body. So he was a, controlling jerk. Awesome. This desire for control is manifest in the instrumental character of his anger and in the fact that Podnichev never sees his wife as a full human being. She is always an object to be managed. Tolstoy's fiction contains many well-drawn and vivacious female characters. Podnichev's wife is not among them. As we are told the story through Podnichev's twisted psyche, such an incomplete portrait is appropriate. It is significant that she is never named or fully described, and hence never has full identity as a person in the account. Podnichev does not see her, neither before nor after death, as a human being with an identity and character separate from his own. With very few exceptions, instances where we do glimpse a portrait of a more fully drawn character, she is presented as a body to be controlled or as an animal to be restrained. Yeah, so this is the contemporary situation where people are still trying to treat others like objects. It's definitely not a full understanding of human beings, at all. And so there's a question is, I guess what is going to happen here is that by transferring the problem from the interpersonal relationship and whatever Podnichev has problems of his own, he's translating it, he's basically putting it all on the sexual issue. That's something outside of themselves. And still not giving his wife credit for being a full human. It was some external bad that was causing their marriage to fail, and not the actual human relations that would be harder for him to grasp. Okay, that's fair. But the idea that you can have a different story afterwards, yeah, it could be an equally bad story, and then Podnichev is just claiming it's better. That's fair. So let's see what the author says. Early in his narrative, Podnichev claims to speak for all men when he says, "What we want is the body." Yeah, so this guy's got his problems here. He makes an explicit connection between society women, presumably including his wife, and prostitutes. Oh, so he's just going the straight up, they're all whore routes. Okay. No, I'm sure everyone knows someone like that. The likening of his wife to a prostitute is enhanced when Podnichev claims that women who practice birth control, again presumably including his own wife, are prostitutes, and further describes a prostitute as one who has descended to the level of not of beasts, but of things. Podnichev does not see his wife as a human being then, but like a prostitute as a thing. At one point, Podnichev declares of his wife, "She is not a human being. She is a bitch, a loathsome bitch." The likening of his wife to an animal is even more explicit when he describes her as similarly to a well-fed, under-exercised horse in full trappings that is suddenly given the rein. I mean, that's good writing, though, at least. That's good writing. Well-fed, under-exercised horse in full trappings that is suddenly given the rein. So you can see this fat horse running around doing whatever it wants, but doesn't really have is out of shape. Podnichev is frank about his desire to control his wife and his frustration that he cannot, saying there was no rein on her at all, as there is no rein on 99% of our women. I realized this and was afraid. Well, at least he's honest about himself sometimes. There are numerous other indications that Podnichev is disturbed by his wife's sexuality and her ability to control her body as she sees fit. He says that there was something challenging, something disturbing about her beauty. He had a cute wife, that's good. It is especially telling that Podnichev is convinced that a factor that was directly responsible for what was to happen, that is, her death at his hands, is the fact that she began to practice birth control after the birth of their 5th child. Which seems like a very reasonable thing to do. He is clearly disturbed and troubled by the possibility of his wife's sexual freedom. That's just her health at that point. You gotta know that people's bodies break down, man. What is perhaps Podnichev's deepest insight into his own motivations occur on the train journey from the country back to Moscow, where he will surprise his wife having dinner with Trukhachevsky and kill her. The awful thing was that I claimed complete and unquestionable ownership of her body as if it were my body, and at the same time I realized I was unable to own her body, that it was not mine, and that she could dispose of it in a way I did not want her to. His act of murder can be seen as an ultimate act of control and domination. Her body has given rise to his anger and frustration, and it is on her body that his anger and revenge will be played out. It is deeply ironic that Podnichev dates the beginning of his moral conversion to the third day after his wife's death, when he sees her lifeless body in the coffin. Only when I saw her face in death did I realize what I had done. He finally sees her as a human being, yet at this point she is not a human being but a lifeless corpse. She has gone from being an object of sexual desire to being an object in the literal sense, a corpse. Well, that's interesting, but it says, like, look, he realized what he had done afterwards. Well, I think the author is a little unfair right here. They're trying to make their point at this spot where you're saying, look, the Podnichev only understands that his wife was a full person when he sees her at a corpse as like an object, but that's not really true. How I would interpret that is when you see someone in their in a human ceremony in an institution and doing something that humans do, in this case being part of a funeral, then you might understand that they had social relations, that they had bigger things than just being an object. But of course, he had never seen her in this way as part of like the bigger populace, but it was too late at that point. So I mean, that she was an object at that point double makes the point of what he's saying, but that he saw her in that way probably was because he had lost all of his anger at that point, but then finally was able to see her as part of a bigger social circle, as being part of humans, the rest of humanity. It seems clear that Podnichev's outward actions, his temper tantrums, and the eventual murder are aimed at controlling his wife. But I want to say something more. His anger facilitates these actions and is a form of self-justification. Podnichev does not get angry and strike out at his wife. Rather, frustrated by his inability to control her, he wants to strike her and becomes angry, thereby allowing himself to commit an act that, at some level, he must realize is wrong. The suggestion that anger can be instrumental or directed toward a goal, and that emotion is in some way subject to a personal choice or acts of will might seem paradoxical, yet such a view of the emotions, which I cannot defend here, has roots in Aristotle and the Stoics, and has been propounded by existentialist thinkers such as Sartre. More recently, Robert Solomon has argued that emotions can be purposive or instrumental, and Patricia Greenspan has defended the view that emotions can play a role in rational choice. Yeah, I mean, this is fine. There's nothing, there's plenty of history that can go into the saying that, like, the emotions can do rational work. Like, that's not a problem. And you can also, like, if you're interested in that, you can go look into that. But like the idea that your emotions can be a guide to like what you should do, you know, your gut check, how you feel about things, that's fine. Podnichev's response to anger and other negative emotions falls into three basic categories. The emotions control him, self-control and mastery of his actions despite the emotion he feels, and willing to assent to negative emotions. I argue that both Podnichev's assent to anger and his suppression of it are best understood as manifestations of self-control. Podnichev is described as being at the mercy of his anger surprisingly few times. The most important incident is on the train journey just before the murder, when he is unable to stop his imagination from conjuring up images of his wife's infidelity and depravity. Here, Podnichev's anger serves to enhance his motivation for murder. If he were to imagine his wife as a loving mother, he would be unlikely to summon the resolution necessary to kill her. And this is fair. I mean, this is in some sense how emotions work. They can be used to focus you. So you can like block out all the other things that might be important. If you can use your anger in a useful way, that's good. If you're using it here just to like build more anger, that tends to be bad. But like, who's to say exactly what the proper use for anger is? Sometimes it is the right thing to be very angry. At other times, Podnishev feels anger welling up inside him, but is able to suppress it. That is, he controls his outward actions so as not to betray his inner rage. This reaction is most clearly evident in his relations with Trukhachevsky. Podnishev is careful not to let his feelings of anger and jealousy show. I was particularly attentive as I saw him out. How else is one to see out the man who has come to destroy the peace and happiness of one's home? With particular warmth, I pressed his soft white hand. Podnishev's self-control comes from his desire to preserve his self-image and his attention to social propriety. You see, this is interesting because, again, it was the social situation where he saw his wife that she became human, granted in a funeral, but like he is someone governed by these sort of social things. It's his view of himself that is really the problem, and his view inside as a social, within a social system. It would not be socially acceptable to behave in a discourteous manner, so he does not. But the anger itself is an implicit judgment of Trukhachevsky and hence his wife as well. Trukhachevsky only represents a threat if Podnishev is suspicious of his wife's virtue. Again, his assessment of her as morally suspect will make it easier for him to rationalize and commit murder. The third and most interesting of Podnishev's reactions to anger is a willing assent to fury accompanied by an intense self-consciousness. In these cases, he is described as making a conscious choice to surrender to his anger. Such surrender is apparent in Podnishev's description of what will be the final thought with his wife before the night of her murder. Suddenly, I was seized by hatred such as I have never felt before, and for the first time I longed to give physical expression to my hatred. I leapt up and made for her, but I remember that just as I leapt up and I became aware of what I was doing, and I asked myself if it was right to give way to my feelings, and answered that it was, because in that way I would frighten her. And so instead of suppressing my hatred, I surrendered myself to it and rejoiced to feel it running riot within me. Similarly, Podnishev remembers that during the murder I realized everything, and not for a moment did I stop realizing it. The more the steam that got my fury generated, the brighter the glow of my consciousness, so that I could not possibly have failed to perceive everything I did. See, this is interesting. It's like, this is him using his hatred to become a monster. You know, he's like, not only is he trying to hurt her, his wife, kill her, he's trying to make her feel bad while he's doing it. Like, this is very effective use of emotions. Terrible, but effective. And so it's like, okay, whatever. It's an interesting story. I mean, this is why the author is using this story. Because, yeah. Anywho, the third type of reaction to anger, willing assent, is most clearly instrumental. Is clearly instrumental, and Podnishev's description of the murder scene is particularly telling. We are given indications that he has already decided that he will kill his wife to punish her for infidelity, real or imagined. He has built up to this point with every angry act and thought. When the final confrontation comes, Podnishev actually luxuriates in his anger, almost savoring it as he finally revenges himself on his wife. His anger facilitates his deeds. A dispassionate murder would be inconsistent with Podnishev's sense of frustration. Here, anger allows him to indulge his wounded pride with appropriate brutality. And this is what, and the author I think is completely on point here, indulge his wounded pride with the brutality. He's trying to make himself feel better at this point by murdering somebody, which is strange, because why does murdering somebody make you feel better? I mean, he thinks she has hurt him by cheating on him, but like, again, he doesn't even know. He's just got these ideas in his head and he is running with it. But that's what it is. Wounded pride is in your head. It's not a social, he has not been shamed socially as far as we know. Okay, Podnishev has rewritten the emotional history of his life and marriage, and he has thereby altered his self-image. At the time of the train journey, he sees himself as morally enlightened, especially as to the true nature of physical passion, and as having acquired greater wisdom and self-knowledge. But has Podnishev really changed? All the information we have is contained in his narratives. A close examination of the text shows that his claims to greater knowledge are at best problematic. Arguably, he has far to go before we can accept his claims of greater understanding and insight. Narrative alone cannot provide the answers. We need more information before we can come to a better understanding of Podnishev. We need to know something about his behavior, specifically his response to frustration, the extent of his ability to control anger, and his treatment of women. Okay, I'm not even sure about this conclusion though. Podnishev could be right. There could have been sexual problems with both of their understandings. That could be part of the story here. It is not the main part of the story, but he may have gotten this much smarter since he murdered his wife. It is not anywhere near enough understanding and like reflection, but he may still have gotten smarter. Now, is he is it, what he do is rationalizing what he did? Yes, he's using probably the littlest piece of knowledge that he has gained and saying, "Oh, this was the actual cause," which is wrong. But he may have actually gotten smarter. He may have actually reflected, but the problem is that he's misplaced his the full blame. He's deflecting here. So, I mean, I agree with the majority of what the author has said here, but I mean, it might be slightly skewed, and even just for the author's just way to press their point. But still, like, you have to give the man a little bit of credit. Maybe that is part of the social, the way sexuality was part of their social class. Maybe that was screwing with their marriage. I don't know. But again, it's deflecting from his own responsibility, which is the major problem, because he's a scumbag murderer who hates women. Yeah. Okay, section 2. The attempt to understand another individual and to determine the extent of her self-understanding may be informed by narrative, but cannot be limited to narrative. I would like to examine one attempt to describe the effects of a genuine increase in self-knowledge and moral understanding. Part of Spinoza's project in the Ethics is to describe an intellectual or moral conversion whereby the individual attains self-mastery and is less subject to the tyranny of negative emotions. A major aspect of this process is the development of reflexive knowledge. Each person has the power to examine critically his or her mental states, come to rational conclusions about them, and suffer less because of them. See, this is how I do it. I just don't think. If you don't think at any time, then you don't have to suffer. As the previous essay we were talking about in the Simone Weil paper. I just waste all my time on Twitch, and then you don't have to think anymore. I suggest you all do that too. The more self-knowledge an individual has, the better he or she is able to discern clearly and distinctly the reasons and causes for particular mental states, and the greater will be the capacity for self-determined action. Yes, just think clearly and distinctly. Solve all your problems. The individual who has gone through such a conversion and is largely self-determined, the free man as Spinoza calls him, strives to conceive things as they are in themselves. Part of what Spinoza means here is that in order to understand emotional situations, we must attempt to view them from a more objective point of view than the perspective of our own interests and desires. No thoughts, just dreams. Exactly, Valpo. It's like, yeah, it's a joke. Because, I watch some, professional streamers. This is what their day job is. They do this all day. But, like, you're working for yourself. And so these people are working long hours, and they do this, like, during the week, like many days of the week, they're working long hours, and then people are really disappointed when they go offline. And I understand, like, maybe you just got there or whatever, but it's like, yeah, no sleep, only stream. No sleep, only stream. It's like, yeah, but what are you gonna do? Everyone's looking for their escape at the moment. So streamer brain. So Juggling says, you can sense the deflection as he continues to say after the death of the wife that she transformed from desire to a dead object instead of realizing that his desires need to be checked from within himself. Yeah, that is the main deflection, and that's what I think the author is pointing to here. I think that's exactly right. That's what the author is saying. Look, the guy didn't really grow. Now, I'm taking the slightly... I mean, it's not right, but it's like there might be a small point that there could be if we take the man at his word, there might be a social thing that was actually screwing with their marriage. That, they didn't get along because there was problems in their social group. Maybe. It's unlikely that that's what's going to make you kill anybody. But, yeah, it's completely right what you're saying, juggling biohazards. Like, the main point is that he didn't get the real reason. Valpo says, I think the pros are impressive. You have to be canny to have that kind of following. Yeah, they're extremely impressive. I was in a stream earlier today, and someone was saying, hey, Amaranth has 17,000 viewers right now. And, I mean, there are lots of pretty women out there. There are a lot of pretty women who will do a lot of things on stream. very few of them have 17,000 people watching them. You have to be extremely smart and good at what you do to get 17,000 people watching and paying you money just to and not break TOS on Twitch. Like, that's like that's incredibly difficult. So yeah, I've been meaning to watch that. I never got around to watching the Vice thing on her. I want to do that. 17,000 viewers is like, that's a crazy number. Okay. View things from a more objective point of view. I wonder what's objective. All right. A more objective point of view than the perspective of our own interests and desires. This will in turn have an effect on how we view others. The individual who is reasonable and self-determined strives to see both himself and others in the light of eternity. That is, she strives to understand events as God might. How do we know when an individual has acquired more or less adequate knowledge about his mental states? Spinoza indicates that someone who has achieved self-mastery will behave in certain ways. Okay, but I mean, they're going to be culturally specific, I'd assume. But anyway, first, they will be neither ascetic nor hedonistic, but will enjoy pleasures, cuisine, athletics, the arts in moderation. In dealing with others, they will not be vengeful, but will attempt to repay hatred or anger with love. They will help others not out of pity, hope, or fear, but because it is the right thing to do. Internally, they will feel self-contentment and be untroubled by hopes or fears, as these emotions indicate lack of knowledge and weakness of mind. Alright, so they turn into the Buddha. A caveat. I am not sure that we can expect to have definite answers regarding another's moral and intellectual transformations. Spinoza allows that certain types of self-deception and inadequate knowledge may provoke behavior similar to that of a morally enlightened individual. For example, someone who held that what Spinoza would regard as religious superstitions might behave just as charitably as someone who had truly acquired virtue. For the purposes of my discussion, it is enough that the individual who has acquired self-understanding will refrain from certain types of actions. Okay, so let's just say you do change as you get older, and maybe there's a class of actions you don't do anymore when you gain wisdom. Maybe. According to Spinoza, then, genuine moral development and self-knowledge will have an effect on how one sees and behaves towards others. That's fair. It is in these areas that we must look to test claims of greater insight and self-knowledge. How does Podnichev fare according to these lights? There are many reasons to think that he has not attained the status of a Spinozistic free man. As I have argued, his claims to moral enlightenment are not to be taken at face value. There is little indication that Podnichev has come to an objective view of the events he recounts. He continues to see himself and his dead wife as having been victims and forces beyond their control. Yeah, he does not take responsibility. It is forces beyond their control. His behavior on the train where he tells his story is not that of a man at peace with himself. The narrator describes him as nervous, with darting eyes, and painstakingly avoiding all talking contact with other passengers. Yeah, see, this is someone still dominated by forces beyond their control. And so the idea that he has grown as a person is weird because he's still fearful of things beyond his control. And so that's the thing. You're trading one boogeyman for another. You traded, the wife problem, Podnichev's problem with his wife, with problems with society. And the question is that a growing benefit or not? But according to these lights, no, because he didn't actually do anything because it hasn't changed his behavior. He's just directed it his nervousness someplace else. In order to illustrate how one of Spinoza's free men might comport himself and act towards others, let us look at another of Tolstoy's protagonists, Ivan Vasilyevich of After the Ball. The structure of After the Ball is quite similar to that of the Kreutzer Sonata. In both protagonists relate past events to an anonymous an anonymous narrator. But while the often agitated Podnichev speaks to a stranger on a train journey, Vasilyevich is surrounded by a group of intimates. The narrator refers to him as our respected friend and is said to speak with great fervor and sincerity. Vasilyevich does not make the same explicit claims to greater knowledge that Podnichev does, but is convinced that the incidents he relates have changed him. My whole life was changed by a single night, or rather a morning. Vasilyevich tells his friends of a night long ago in his youth when he attended a ball and danced with a girl he loved. He remembers being especially touched by the sight of the girl dancing with her aged father. Later, the next morning after the ball, he sees the father, an army officer, supervising the cruel and violent punishment of a Tatar deserter. Vasilyevich is tormented by the scene and unable to get it out of his mind. His confusion and distress causes him to become a good-for-nothing. He changes his plan to join the army, and his love for the girl evaporates. Yet we are given indication that his self-described status as a good-for-nothing is not correct. One of the assembled listeners protests. It would be more to the point to say how many people you would have turned out to be. It would be more to the point to say how many people would have turned out to be good for nothing had it not been for you. So he's saying, yeah, you've done good for so many. Vasilyevich never blames anyone else for his lack of material success, nor does the conduct of her father cause him to lose respect for the girl he once loved. Overall, the tone of his reminiscences is strikingly different from that of Podnichev's. While there are numerous indications in the Kreutzer Sonata that Podnichev has not transcended the views on sexuality in women that he so vehemently decries, Vasilyevich's recognition of the horror of corporal punishment is meant to be seen as an instance of genuine understanding and increased self-knowledge. We can see this in the manner in which each man tells his story. Vasilyevich is calm and surrounded by friends. Podnichev is socially isolated, nervous, quick to anger, and seems unstable. Vasilyevich seems to have made concrete changes in his life, beginning with his decision not to enter the army. Podnichev is still riding the train. You know, this seems like, okay, the development the author here is talking about is psychological. So either you have psychologically changed in a behavioral way, or you have not. So it's like, what is the behavioral changes? Now, the real question of this essay is, can you see behavioral changes written in stories, in the narrative? What is the limit of the narrative here? Now, can you read someone's behaviors off of their narratives? Maybe. And that's interesting. Like, maybe you can actually get how somebody acts or behaves off how they're writing and telling stories. Now, is there a reflection of the story of the person in their stories? Yes. How closely linked are those things? I don't know. But like, yeah, you can, but for the character in the story, we can read their behavior off what they're saying in the story, but are we actually getting that off people? I don't know. Like, these stories, these narratives are designed to tell you something, but how realistic are they actually? I'm sure they seem like they might actually happen. They could be true, but I'm wondering exactly how closely tied my stories are to what my behavior is, and why, there's psychotic people out there who say the right thing but do not do the right thing. Now, can you sometimes realize that they're nuts because of what they're saying? Yeah, maybe. Not always. Thank you, Juglin. Author says, okay, this is it. I've illustrated my worries about the epistemological status of personal narratives through an examination of two fictional narratives by one great writer. There are several reasons why I think this is a fruitful strategy. Alright, so this is interesting. The author thinks this is a good idea. Genuine personal narratives usually lack the coherence and elegance of those recounted in literary fiction. Indeed, I think we are rightly suspicious of personal narratives that seem too polished and too practiced. We expect a certain amount of inarticulateness and clumsiness in the authentic accounts of ordinary people. Moreover, in a genuine personal narrative, as much may be conveyed by gestures, tones of voice, and lapsed silence as is by words. While the text of a literary narrative does not change with the repeated reading, personal narratives can be more or less elaborated or expurgated depending on who is being addressed. Even the stories told only for our own benefit can change with time and circumstances. When we change the stories we tell, we reflect a different understanding of the events described, or at least we are putting a different construction on them. To find out whether this different understanding is also better, we need to look beyond the narrative to actions, being in the world, and the treatment of others. Yeah, I mean, this is it. In the end, the author isn't like stupid here. They know you have to look farther along in what they're doing to see if what they say is matching up with what they do. I mean, do you walk the walk, or do you talk the talk? Like, do you talk the talk only, or do you actually walk the walk? And so, this is the question. And this question of like why people are liars anyway. Like, people are lying to themselves, they're lying to others, but like, can that actually be maintained over time? I was just reading this book about a Native American philosopher saying, look, when you have these stories that are written down, like in literary fiction, you can construct these things. But if you don't have like a written history of the story, either you're telling it because this is what you want it to be made up, or you're telling it because that's the truth and that's all there is. But if you have to be making stuff up, it gets harder and harder to maintain lies over time. And so in some sense, your stories have to become closer to how you are if you are always telling the stories over and over and over. So there's a question of oral tradition beating out of you these lies and that you might be telling yourself. Because if you have to always remember your lies, it won't get beaten out. It'll get beaten out of you because you have to always be telling the stories over and over. And so this is the thing. Podnishev is telling this bullshit story about why he killed his wife, being made up something over and over, but he's repeating this story to himself because it's not true. He hasn't changed. He hasn't grown in anything. This other story is that, look, the person's changed and they can recall their story with whatever history there is, but it doesn't really matter because the person is better at that point. And now there's the question. Can you actually read off, like, how good an actor are these people? Like, can you read off how they feel about themselves and what's going on psychologically with them by how they tell a story? Well, this is why we get people on the stand in like courtrooms, is because you can kind of see that it gets harder when you're under stress to, maintain your story if you're not telling the truth. Can this be abused? Absolutely. But can I tell you a better lie now? This is why I wrote it on the screen. It's like, well, exactly how am I telling you the story? Can I tell you a better lie now than I could in the past? Absolutely. I can lie better now than I did back then. But can I maintain it over time? No. I mean, I can maintain it over a short distance of time. I mean, if we're talking over weeks, months, years, it gets harder and harder to maintain. And so this is the thing. Are you going to bullshit this old story, and will that be obvious eventually? Yeah, maybe. And so I think this author has a point. If you're going to do that, it's going to be harder. Now, can you read it off, like given some sort of psychological development, Spinozistic or otherwise? These things are going to be culturally dependent, I guess you could say. But probably in the culture, like if you're not a stupid person, you will be able to figure stuff out. Okay. Any questions on this one? Anything else to be said? I don't have, I think I'm starting to lose my mind. Streamer brain is taking over.